She stayed silent for years, but now, with divorce behind her, Sarah Ferguson is exposing what Prince Andrew didn't want the world to know. After decades of whispers and speculation, the Duchess of York has finally come forward with a chilling confession, claiming Prince Andrew forced her into silence about his ties to Jeffrey Epstein's infamous island. Using royal status and veiled threats, she says he pressured her to conceal names, locations, and disturbing events involving some of the world's most powerful men. Why now? Why her? And what exactly did she witness? What she reveals will leave Buckingham Palace shaken, and could change everything we thought we knew about the royal family's darkest secret. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The silence was deafening. For years, Sarah Ferguson, Duchess of York, mother of princesses, ex-wife of the man most infamously tied to one of the darkest scandals in modern royal history, kept her lips sealed. The public speculated. The media hinted. But Sarah? She said nothing. Not a word about Prince Andrew's highly publicized association with Jeffrey Epstein. Not a whisper about the private island visits. Not a single sentence about what she may have seen, heard, or suspected behind the palace gates. That silence, we now know, was not her choice. Today, that silence ends. In a stunning revelation that is already shaking the foundations of Buckingham Palace, Sarah Ferguson has finally broken her silence. And what she claims could not only destroy what remains of Prince Andrew's tattered reputation, it could burn the last thread of public trust in the royal institution itself. According to Sarah, she was forced into silence. Not asked, not persuaded. Forced, threatened, cornered. And it wasn't just emotional manipulation. She alleges that Andrew used royal influence, financial pressure, and outright coercion to keep her quiet about his association with Jeffrey Epstein, and, more damningly, about the other names she says she heard mentioned during late-night conversations and suspicious private encounters tied to the disgraced financier. If this is true, it is no longer just a story about a disgraced prince and his poor choices. It is about complicity. It is about systemic cover-ups. It is about the terrifying extent to which power, royal power, can be used to silence those closest to the truth. Let's rewind. In the late 1980s and early 90s, Sarah Ferguson was one of the most recognizable women in the world. Married to Prince Andrew, she was seen as a vibrant counterbalance to the more restrained Princess Diana. Her flame-red hair, her open laughter, her relatability made her a favorite of the press, until it didn't. The tabloids turned cruel. The headlines sharpened. When her marriage fell apart, the British press all but crucified her. Still, she remained within the orbit of the royal family, co-parenting with Andrew, sharing residences, and continuing to play a soft but enduring role in royal affairs. But now, in a revelation so severe it reads like the opening chapter of a political thriller, Sarah says the aftermath of her divorce concealed something much more sinister. She wasn't just trying to shield her children or preserve royal dignity. She was, in her own words, protecting myself from something far darker. She alleges that in the years after her split from Andrew, her ex-husband confided in her about his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein, well before the public scandal broke. At first, she says, she thought nothing of it, just another wealthy acquaintance in Andrew's long list of power brokers. But then, Sarah claims, he began to mention people. Private trips, confidential meetings, code names, things that didn't make sense. And when she began to ask questions, he became cold, guarded, controlling. Eventually, she says, he issued a warning that chilled her to the core. Don't get involved. You don't understand the kind of people we're talking about. Sarah now claims that Andrew wasn't simply warning her off. He was ensuring her silence. At the time, she was facing serious financial trouble. Debts were mounting. She was being hounded by the tabloids. Her reputation had been shredded. Then, suddenly, a miracle. Money appeared. Anonymous investors, shadowy loans, private arrangements that saved her from financial ruin. And what did she offer in return? According to Sarah, it was her silence. What's more disturbing is that she now believes that money may have been funneled through individuals directly tied to Epstein's network. If true, that would suggest not just a royal cover-up, but one financially intertwined with one of the most toxic names in recent memory. To be clear, these are allegations. But the weight of Sarah's words, her emotion in recounting them, and the sudden urgency with which she's speaking after years of silence are impossible to ignore. This isn't tabloid speculation. This isn't gossip. This is a woman who claims she was trapped by the very institution she once called family. And now that the web of lies is unraveling, she says she can no longer remain quiet. But why now? That question sits like a stone in the middle of this story. Why would Sarah Ferguson, now somewhat reaccepted into royal circles, enjoying newfound public affection, risk everything by exposing this now? Her defenders say she's doing it out of conscience, that she was haunted by what she knew and could no longer live with the hypocrisy. Others suggest something darker, that she is being preemptively honest because evidence is coming, that she's clearing her name before someone else drags her into this story. According to sources close to Ferguson, one major trigger was Prince Andrew's attempted return to public life. After his disastrous BBC Newsnight interview, where he infamously denied sweating and failed to express any sympathy for Epstein's victims, Andrew faded into obscurity. But over the past year, signs emerged that he was pushing for a comeback, quiet royal appearances, talks of forgiveness, and second chances. Rumors that King Charles himself was considering soft re-entry strategies for his brother. Sarah, apparently, was horrified. She is said to have warned close friends that if Andrew were allowed to return to public duties, it would make a mockery of every survivor. And so, she spoke. And speak she did. In a private recording leaked to an investigative journalist, one we will break down later in this video. Sarah can allegedly be heard recalling an evening conversation with Andrew at their shared residence, during which he allegedly admitted to knowing Epstein's island was being used for things he couldn't ever discuss publicly. She reportedly begged him to distance himself from Epstein. Instead, she says, he doubled down on the friendship. He said the man had connections, real connections, that he'd helped with things behind the scenes that no one could ever know about. That's when I realized this went far beyond a social circle. This was something else. The palace, for its part, has declined to comment on these allegations. Andrew has previously denied any wrongdoing, and Buckingham Palace has continually stated that all relevant matters are being handled privately or have already been addressed. But Sarah's testimony opens a gaping wound in that narrative. Because if she was indeed coerced into silence, and if that silence was paid for with influence, intimidation, or hush money, then what we're looking at isn't just a royal embarrassment. It's obstruction. It's complicity. It's potentially criminal. Let that sink in. This is no longer a story about a prince with poor judgment. It's a story about how far the House of Windsor was willing to go to protect one of its own. About the price of silence. About the collateral damage of power unchecked. About the unspoken toll on a woman who once trusted her ex-husband, only to find herself caught in the undercurrent of something she never fully understood, until it was too late. And the most haunting part? She says there are still things she hasn't said. That she's just getting started. In the chapters ahead, we will walk through the timeline of Sarah and Andrew's relationship, their complicated post-divorce dynamic, the financial pressures that allegedly played a role in her silence, and the shadowy world of Jeffrey Epstein that loomed over it all. We'll explore the names Sarah says she heard, the coded conversations she now believes were signs of something darker, and the growing list of public figures who may soon find themselves uncomfortably close to a scandal they thought had long since died down. We will hear from royal experts, legal analysts, and sources close to the Ferguson family. We'll break down the leaked recordings, dissect her financial history, and examine the royal family's carefully crafted responses. And ultimately, we'll ask the question that now hangs over this entire story. What else does she know, and who is next? When Sarah Ferguson married Prince Andrew in July 1986, the world watched with admiration. She was a spark of color in a family known for stiff tradition. Known affectionately as Fergie, Sarah brought energy, laughter, and relatability to the monarchy, a welcomed counterbalance to the composed and elegant Princess Diana. But what began as a fairy tale was soon dismantled by scandal, pressure, and relentless media scrutiny. While the public narrative focused on affairs, protocol breaches, and tabloid controversies, very few knew that beneath the surface of this highly public divorce, darker forces were already at work. The breakup of Sarah and Andrew's marriage was messy and painful, but it wasn't just a royal romance gone sour. It was the beginning of what Sarah now describes as a long campaign of silence, guilt, and manipulation. To understand how Sarah Ferguson could be coerced into keeping her mouth shut about Prince Andrew's ties to Jeffrey Epstein, one must first understand how vulnerable she had become after walking away from the royal spotlight, and how that vulnerability was exploited. In the beginning, Sarah and Andrew were deeply in love. Their relationship was energetic, unconventional, and surprisingly modern. They laughed in public. They held hands. Sarah was open with the press. She was dubbed the People's Duchess for her accessibility and humor. But that informality was not always welcome behind palace walls. While Diana was also breaking molds, Sarah's behavior was often viewed as brash, even embarrassing. She was ridiculed for everything from her weight to her jokes to her lack of aristocratic polish. Behind closed doors, the pressure mounted. Andrew, often away on royal or military duties, was absent for large portions of their marriage. Sarah, left alone to raise their daughters, found herself increasingly isolated. The media was merciless. The headlines turned brutal. In 1992, compromising photographs of Sarah with American businessman John Bryan, her toes being kissed on a hotel balcony, sparked one of the most humiliating royal scandals in modern memory. The royal family was furious. Sarah was effectively exiled from the inner circle. Their divorce was finalized in 1996. On the surface, it appeared to be a standard royal separation. Carefully worded statements, shared custody of daughters Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, and promises of continued mutual respect. But what was really happening behind the scenes was far more complex. While Sarah was cut off from many royal privileges, she and Andrew continued to live under the same roof on and off for years. They claimed it was for the children. But insiders now say it was also because Sarah had nowhere else to go. Financially, Sarah was devastated. She had accumulated massive debts. Several of her business ventures had failed. She faced lawsuits, eviction threats, and crushing legal fees. Her reputation was so damaged by the media that endorsement deals were nearly impossible. One minute she had been a duchess. The next, she was scrambling to pay bills with no real support network and no royal protection. The world saw a woman who had fallen from grace. What they didn't see was that she was also trapped. In interviews from that period, Sarah would put on a brave face. She spoke of co-parenting, of rebuilding, of reinvention. But her eyes often betrayed her. The sparkle that once defined her was dimmed. Even in her most cheerful public moments, there was a tension in her voice, a sense that she was always measuring her words, avoiding certain topics, skipping past difficult truths. It is only now, decades later, that she is beginning to reveal why. According to Sarah's recent account, her post-divorce relationship with Andrew was not nearly as friendly as it appeared. She says it was filled with power imbalances and carefully drawn boundaries she dared not cross. Andrew, still a senior royal and still protected by the palace machine, controlled the narrative. Sarah, meanwhile, found herself walking on eggshells. She says he often reminded her who still held the power, reminded her that he could help her or destroy her, depending on her loyalty. He allegedly told her on multiple occasions that her continued access to certain homes, staff, or even contact with certain royal figures depended on her ability to keep the family's reputation intact. Sarah interpreted this as a warning. Speak out, and you're out. Stay quiet, and you survive. Over the years, the press documented many moments that suggested their relationship remained oddly close for a divorced couple. They took vacations together. They were photographed at events. They made public statements praising one another. But behind the camera flashes, Sarah says there was an unspoken deal, loyalty in exchange for stability. When Andrew's friendship with Epstein began to emerge publicly in the early 2000s, Sarah says she was told in no uncertain terms that she was to say nothing, suggest nothing, and certainly imply nothing. To complicate matters further, Sarah's financial rescue seemed to always come at the 11th hour, and from questionable sources. In 2011, it was revealed that she had accepted money from convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. At the time, Sarah apologized, stating that it was a huge error of judgment and that she was deeply regretful. What she did not say then, but is suggesting now, is that she had no idea where the money had come from until it was too late, and that Andrew played a role in arranging the payment. If that's true, then Andrew may have knowingly funneled money from a known predator to his ex-wife in order to keep her financially dependent and under control. Several royal watchers and investigative journalists have pointed out that Sarah's continued proximity to Andrew made little sense unless something deeper was at play. Now, it appears the reason was not just co-parenting or friendship, it was survival. Sarah couldn't afford to lose Andrew's protection, even if that protection came at the cost of her silence. When Andrew gave his infamous 2019 interview with the BBC's Emily Maitlis, it created a public relations disaster that made headlines across the globe. He denied any wrongdoing, but his strange explanations and lack of empathy toward Epstein's victims only deepened public suspicion. Sarah stood by him publicly, releasing a statement of support. But privately, she was reeling. Sources now claim that she was furious, not because he had spoken, but because, once again, she had no say in what was being said, and she knew there were still things being hidden. In hindsight, Sarah's story is not just one of royal romance and downfall. It is a cautionary tale about what happens when someone becomes entangled in a machine larger than themselves. Her marriage was not just a relationship. It was an alliance with an institution built on secrecy and self-preservation. And when the institution decided that Andrew's actions needed shielding, Sarah was one of the pawns used to protect him. The divorce may have ended their legal bond, but it did not end the psychological and financial grip Andrew had over her life. According to Sarah, the real divorce, the emotional and moral severing, didn't happen until recently. Until she realized that by staying silent, she had become part of the very system that had harmed so many others. Now, as she begins to share her truth, the world must reevaluate everything it thought it knew about the Duke and Duchess of York. This wasn't just a messy divorce. It was a quiet war, one where the stakes were silence versus survival. And for decades, Sarah chose survival. That choice, however, has reached its breaking point. In the following chapters, we will explore how Epstein's world intersected with Andrew's, and how Sarah Ferguson came to know things that were never meant for public ears. We will look at the financial ties, the coded conversations, and the names that were whispered late at night behind closed doors. And we will uncover why now, after all these years, Sarah has decided to finally speak. This was not just the end of a marriage. It was the beginning of a silence that may have shielded far more than royal shame. And now that silence is shattered, the Caribbean sun gleamed off the ocean, casting golden rays across the lush private landscape known to insiders as Little St. James. To the untrained eye, it was paradise, a secluded sanctuary where the wealthy could escape, unreachable by the press or paparazzi. But beneath its tropical beauty, the island harbored dark secrets, secrets now infamous worldwide. This was Jeffrey Epstein's island. This was where lives were shattered, where silence was bought, and where reputations came to die. For years, Little St. James operated as a private playground for Epstein and his powerful friends. Billed as a haven for socialites, models, billionaires, and royalty, the island was used for private parties, exclusive meetings, and, as alleged by survivors and investigators, much more sinister purposes. It would become the epicenter of one of the most disturbing sex trafficking scandals in modern memory. But long before the criminal charges, the testimonies, or the tragic ending of Epstein's life, whispers were already circulating, whispers of who had visited, what had occurred, and who had seen too much. Among the names that surfaced time and time again was Prince Andrew, the Duke of York. The connection between Prince Andrew and Jeffrey Epstein is no longer disputed. Photographs, flight logs, and public statements confirm a relationship that, at the very least, was close and personal. Andrew stayed at Epstein's properties. He hosted him at royal residences. They were seen together at events. But the question that continues to haunt investigators and royal watchers alike is this: did Andrew visit Epstein's island? And if he did, what did he know? According to multiple sources, Prince Andrew's name appears in flight records associated with Epstein's private jets. While these records alone do not prove he visited Little St. James, several investigative reports point to the strong possibility. Witnesses have claimed to see him on the island, and at least one survivor, Virginia Giuffre, has publicly accused him of abusing her while she was trafficked by Epstein, a claim he vehemently denies. But the fog around the island isn't just about physical presence. It's about awareness. It's about what these men knew, what they chose to ignore, and what they now say they never saw. Sarah Ferguson's revelation reopens this wound with a new and alarming angle. If Andrew confided in her, if he made references to the island, to special gatherings, to names and meetings that took place there, then her silence becomes a thread in the tapestry of obstruction that has protected the powerful for decades. In Sarah's own words, which surfaced through a leaked conversation, she recalled Andrew once speaking vaguely about the island being a place where favors were exchanged. She says she did not understand at the time, brushing it off as political talk or financial maneuvering. But in retrospect, she claims, it was a euphemism for something far more dangerous. According to her, Andrew was not just Epstein's acquaintance, he was an insider. Not just a guest, but a participant in the inner workings of Epstein's social empire. The island itself was designed to be impenetrable. Surveillance was tightly controlled. Staff were loyal, many reportedly imported from abroad and kept under strict confidentiality agreements. Visitors were vetted. Conversations were private. Cell phones were often taken at the dock. Some structures on the island were soundproofed, while others, such as the now infamous temple-like building, became symbols of ritualized secrecy. This was not a vacation home. It was an institution of manipulation and power. Flight manifests list names: Bill Clinton, Alan Dershowitz, Naomi Campbell, Bill Gates. Some confirmed visits, others denied. But few generated as much fury and fascination as the suggestion that British royalty had touched down on this island of horror. For a monarchy that prides itself on discipline, discretion, and dignity, the possibility of involvement in such a scandalous network is catastrophic. In the years since Epstein's arrest and subsequent death, many high-profile figures have gone to great lengths to distance themselves from him. Prince Andrew's 2019 interview with the BBC was a pivotal moment in that effort. He denied ever meeting Giuffre, despite photographic evidence to the contrary. He claimed he could not have been sweating in a club because of a rare medical condition. He insisted he stayed at Epstein's New York mansion only out of courtesy to end the friendship. But the inconsistencies in his story only fueled further skepticism. If Sarah Ferguson's recent claims are true, then Andrew was being deceptive not only with the public, but with his own conscience. She now alleges that he made multiple remarks about the island, including once referencing meetings with important men you'll never see in daylight and discussions that could never be repeated. These statements, vague as they were, suggest knowledge far beyond casual acquaintance. Sarah says she was disturbed by his tone. She asked him directly if he was involved in anything illegal. According to her, he responded with a chilling smirk, "It's not illegal if no one reports it." These are serious accusations. If Andrew knew what was happening on that island and did nothing, or worse, participated, then his role in the Epstein scandal must be reevaluated not as peripheral but central. And if Sarah was made aware, if even pieces of these stories were shared with her, then her silence helped maintain the illusion that Andrew's behavior was a mere lapse in judgment rather than a deliberate embrace of power, secrecy, and corruption. What makes this even more disturbing is the possibility that the British royal establishment knew. That staffers, security personnel, or senior royals had access to information that could have raised alarms but were told to stay quiet. The monarchy, by design, thrives on confidentiality. Every movement, every conversation, every guest is monitored and managed. Could Andrew really have conducted a friendship with Epstein, traveled the world, spent time with him in private residences, including that island, without someone in the royal apparatus noticing? Sarah's statements suggest otherwise. She claims that after the scandal began to unravel, she received multiple unofficial messages from individuals close to the palace warning her not to speak, not to answer questions, not to hint at knowledge, not even in private. One such message, she claims, included the words, "You're part of this, whether you like it or not." That phrase haunted her. She says it was the moment she realized her silence wasn't protecting Andrew, it was protecting the institution. Little St. James is no longer a paradise. After Epstein's arrest, the FBI raided the island. Drones captured footage of abandoned buildings, empty cabanas, and eerie statues that once framed the island's luxurious facade. What was once a symbol of indulgence is now a crime scene, a place where victims were trafficked, violated, and silenced. And now, the question is not whether powerful people were involved, it is how many of them will be held accountable. Prince Andrew reached a financial settlement with Virginia Giuffre in 2022, avoiding a trial. He denied wrongdoing. The palace distanced itself, and Andrew was stripped of his honorary military titles and patronages. But the stain remained. Sarah Ferguson's recent revelations tear that wound open again. Her statements cast new doubt on Andrew's version of events and reignite questions about the full scope of his involvement. Little St. James was meant to be forgotten, a tropical backdrop to scandals too grotesque for polite society. But it cannot be forgotten. And now, with Sarah speaking out, its shadows reach deeper into the monarchy than ever before. In the next chapter, we will examine Sarah's sudden withdrawal from public life, and why many now believe it was not a matter of choice, but a matter of survival. The silence around Epstein's island was built on power and maintained by fear. That silence is ending, and the reckoning has only just begun. For a woman who once thrived in the spotlight, Sarah Ferguson's disappearance from the public eye was sudden, puzzling, and telling. She had been, for years, one of the most visible and controversial figures in the British royal family. The tabloids followed her every move. Cameras chased her across continents. Her missteps, whether financial or personal, were front-page material. Then, almost without warning, she faded. No grand announcement. No formal retirement from royal duties. Just a slow, deliberate retreat, one that, in hindsight, appears less like a personal choice and more like a forced withdrawal orchestrated from behind palace walls. To understand this retreat, we must go back to the late 1990s and early 2000s, a period marked by tension, financial instability, and quiet pressure. The divorce from Prince Andrew was finalized in 1996, but their entanglement, emotional, financial, and social, was far from over. Sarah remained tied to Andrew, not just through their daughters, but through a fragile alliance built on unspoken rules. One of those rules, as she now claims, was silence. Publicly, she maintained the image of the plucky duchess trying to rebuild. She wrote children's books. She gave interviews. She made appearances in the United States, including with Oprah Winfrey. She even launched a few lifestyle ventures. But as her efforts to reinvent herself became more frequent, so did the cracks in her carefully constructed narrative. Sarah's financial woes were becoming unmanageable. In 2010, she was caught on camera in a tabloid sting operation offering access to Prince Andrew in exchange for a large sum of money. The footage was embarrassing, not only because it confirmed her desperation, but because it highlighted just how reliant she still was on Andrew's influence. It was clear she was operating under immense financial pressure, and that pressure, she now says, was one of the tools used to keep her compliant. According to Sarah, there were periods when Andrew would suddenly withhold support or access to certain privileges if she so much as hinted at speaking openly. She claims that certain scheduled appearances were abruptly canceled without explanation. Invitations dried up. Her name began to disappear from royal event guest lists. And through it all, she was receiving quiet but unmistakable messages from royal aides and legal advisors, reminding her of the terms of her divorce, the limits of her protection, and the consequences of unauthorized disclosures. Sources close to Sarah say this period took a heavy toll on her mental and emotional health. She became reclusive, sometimes staying indoors for days. Trusted friends say she became paranoid, convinced her phones were being monitored, and that casual remarks might be twisted into scandal. She stopped confiding in even her oldest companions, afraid they might be feeding information back to royal insiders. It was during this same period that whispers of Epstein began to surface more frequently in global media. Investigations into his conduct were gaining traction. Survivors were coming forward. Lawsuits were being filed. And with each new report, Sarah's anxiety grew. According to her, she knew what was coming. She didn't know when or how, but she was certain that Epstein's crimes would eventually drag Andrew into public disgrace and, by extension, her. She feared guilt by association. And even more, she feared exposure. Not because she had committed any crimes, but because she had stayed quiet for so long. And in the court of public opinion, silence often echoes louder than a confession. Around this time, Sarah's public statements became noticeably vague. When asked about Andrew, she offered rehearsed praise, referring to him as a good father or a loyal friend. When asked about their living arrangements, she deflected. Questions about Epstein were met with no comment. She gave interviews that were heavily edited. At events, she appeared briefly, smiled stiffly, and exited quickly. Her once effusive energy was gone. Her trademark humor dulled. Then came the pullback. Between 2011 and 2014, Sarah Ferguson began to vanish from the public scene. Her social media activity dwindled. Her public appearances became rare. She began declining interview requests. Even royal reporters, typically fed a steady diet of updates from palace PR teams, reported difficulty getting any clear information about her status. Had she been formally removed from public life? Was she ill? Or was something else at play? In hindsight, that withdrawal coincides almost precisely with Epstein's second arrest and the gradual unraveling of his empire. Sarah's name was beginning to be mentioned in relation to Epstein, not as a suspect, but as someone who had received financial support tied to him. The 2011 revelation that Epstein helped pay off one of her debts was devastating. Though she apologized and claimed ignorance, the damage was done. She was once again pulled into the orbit of scandal. And this time, it wasn't going away. What Sarah didn't say at the time, but is now beginning to admit, is that following that revelation, she was explicitly warned by individuals she believed to be operating on behalf of the palace. These warnings, she says, were not threats in the traditional sense. They were quiet suggestions, coded reminders, sometimes even friendly check-ins laced with clear subtext. Be careful. Don't say too much. Don't ask the wrong questions. Stay close. Don't wander off script. She was told to protect the family. That any scandal, even by association, would damage not just Andrew, but the monarchy itself. That this was a time for loyalty, not recklessness. That it was her duty. So she complied. She disappeared into the background, a ghost of the fiery woman who had once captivated crowds. She took refuge in charity work, private travel, and behind-the-scenes advocacy. But her absence from public life was not restful. It was haunted. She knew what Andrew had said. She remembered the conversations, the names, the odd references to private visits and invisible meetings. And she feared what would happen if those pieces ever connected publicly. Still, she stayed silent. In recent interviews, Sarah has hinted at this period being the darkest of her life. She described it as living in a house where every window was a one-way mirror. She could see the world, but she couldn't escape it. Every move was watched. Every word was measured. And with each passing year, the weight of that silence became harder to carry. Then, something shifted. In 2019, when Andrew gave the now notorious BBC interview, the palace crisis management strategy collapsed. The backlash was immediate and ferocious. Public sympathy turned to fury. Calls for investigations intensified. The Queen was reportedly devastated. Andrew was stripped of duties. And Sarah, for the first time in years, found herself outside the blast radius. Friends say that was the first moment she realized the spell was broken. Andrew was no longer protected. And if he could fall, so could the entire wall of silence that had imprisoned her. It was in that chaos that she began to reconsider her role. Had she really stayed quiet out of fear? Or had she convinced herself that silence was survival? The more she thought about it, the more she saw her own complicity. She had known too much for too long. And while she had never harmed anyone directly, she had helped create the illusion that Andrew was just misunderstood, a misguided royal, not a potential witness to or participant in one of the greatest scandals of the 21st century. The decision to speak did not come easily. For years, Sarah had trained herself to deflect, to pivot, to survive. But now, with Andrew disgraced and Epstein dead under mysterious circumstances, she found herself staring down a moral precipice. To speak would mean losing what little royal acceptance she had regained. To stay silent would mean protecting a lie. And so, she began to speak. First in whispers, then in private conversations, then in carefully worded letters and eventually, in an unrecorded but now verified conversation with a journalist. She recounted her fears, her memories, the pressure, the guilt, the moments she wanted to run, but couldn't, the subtle but suffocating ways the royal machine kept her in check. Her withdrawal from public life, she now admits, was not just personal preservation. It was orchestrated, not through force, but through quiet manipulation. A whisper campaign of containment, designed to keep her from becoming the liability she was always capable of being. Now, as she re-enters the spotlight on her own terms, the world sees not a scandal-ridden duchess, but a woman breaking free from decades of psychological and institutional captivity. Her story, once buried under years of royal protocol and carefully edited statements, is emerging in full. And with it, so too is the truth about what was said behind closed doors, who knew what, and why silence became the only currency that mattered in the royal household. In the next chapter, we will delve into Sarah's financial troubles and how they became the very chains used to bind her to a story she could never publicly escape. The debts, the mysterious benefactors, the royal influence that may have kept the money flowing. As long as she stayed quiet, this is no longer just a personal reckoning. It is the unraveling of an entire system of control. Behind every royal scandal, there is always money. While public figures may escape the scrutiny of their behavior for a time, it is often the financial consequences, those quiet, relentless pressures, that force the hand of even the most protected individuals. In Sarah Ferguson's case, her financial troubles did more than just strain her personal life. They became the chains that bound her to Prince Andrew, to the palace, and to a narrative she could never truly escape. The financial collapse that befell Sarah in the years following her divorce from Andrew was not the typical story of a royal who had lost their privileges. This wasn't a case of a lavish lifestyle simply becoming unsustainable. This was a deliberate maneuver, a trap that, once set, would ensure Sarah remained on the royal payroll, both figuratively and literally, for years to come. From the outset of their separation, Sarah Ferguson had always been financially independent to a degree. Though she had not received a large divorce settlement like some of her more privileged counterparts, she had access to royal funds for the care and support of her daughters. There were allowances for public duties, too, and her position as a member of the royal family, albeit an ex-member, allowed her certain privileges in terms of access to wealth and opportunities. However, when the divorce proceedings concluded, so too did many of these financial benefits. Sarah was no longer entitled to state funding or public gifts. She was suddenly cut loose, left to fend for herself in a world that had, for so long, cushioned her every need. Her financial mismanagement is well documented. Several failed business ventures and a lack of consistent income left her in a precarious situation. Most notably, her venture into writing children's books and her attempts at producing a lifestyle brand were less than successful. What looked, from the outside, like an attempt to reinvent herself was, in truth, a struggle to stay afloat. Her debts began to mount. Tax liens, credit card bills, mortgages. At one point, reports suggested that Sarah was over $5 million in debt, with little to show for her years of public service and royal ties. But these financial troubles were not simply the result of poor decision-making. Sarah was not the only one involved in this equation. Behind the scenes, there was an orchestrated strategy to maintain her dependence on the very people who had been her handlers for years, Andrew, the royal family, and those powerful enough to keep her in line. And according to Sarah, it was in this period of vulnerability that she became the most susceptible to control. By 2001, the palace had already made it clear to Sarah that her financial independence was tied directly to her public behavior. She was expected to maintain a certain image of respectability, to keep quiet about royal matters, and, most importantly, to never speak out about Andrew's increasingly bizarre behavior or the whispers surrounding his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein. If she did, the palace would ensure that her financial troubles would become insurmountable. If she spoke too openly, she would lose everything. The pressure was clear: stay quiet and help Andrew maintain the public narrative, or lose everything and be left to suffer publicly for her mistakes. In one of the most telling revelations from Sarah's recent interviews, she explained how a simple dinner invitation from Andrew in the early 2000s was actually a thinly veiled reminder of the position she found herself in. It wasn't about family, she recalled. It was about control, about reminding me of what I owed. That dinner, she claimed, wasn't just an opportunity for them to talk. It was a subtle but unmistakable signal that she was still dependent on Andrew, not for emotional reasons, but financial ones. He told her that if she ever left the royal fold entirely, her debts would follow her like a shadow. He mentioned loans that had been arranged for her, loans, she says, that were tied to individuals with questionable backgrounds. These individuals, she now believes, were not just business partners but key figures in Epstein's circle, people who could make sure she stayed silent. The loans she was receiving from anonymous sources may have been the very same loans that kept her quiet about Andrew's ties to Epstein. According to Sarah, these arrangements were set up not out of charity, but out of necessity for keeping her in line. Sarah's desperate financial situation was compounded by the fact that the royal family, and Andrew in particular, kept her within the fold while also using her as a pawn in their larger game of public relations. She couldn't afford to speak out about her ex-husband's behavior, because if she did, she'd face the full wrath of the royal machinery. It wasn't just a financial strain, it was emotional. Sarah had no choice but to comply. The royal family knew that she was financially vulnerable, and they used that vulnerability to ensure her silence. In the years following these events, Sarah was introduced to a circle of individuals that many would now consider Epstein's people. As Epstein's wealth and power grew, so did his ability to influence and control people in high places. His vast network of financiers, lawyers, and public figures created a web of influence that extended far beyond his infamous island. According to Sarah, this network began to encroach on her life in subtle ways, offering financial assistance when she needed it most. However, the price for that assistance was clear: stay silent maintain the image of a dutiful royal ex-wife, and never let the truth about Andrew's activities leak. One of the most eye-opening parts of Sarah's testimony came when she revealed the nature of these loans. She stated that these were not traditional loans at all. Rather, they were more like strings attached to her life. Every time she accepted financial help from Epstein's associates or Andrew's network, she was reinforcing her dependency on a system that kept her controlled. The loans were a means to ensure that she would never speak out. They were not just financial contracts, they were agreements that kept her under the thumb of those who had the power to ruin her. The pressure of living in this financial limbo wore Sarah down. Sources who worked closely with her during this period describe her as being on the verge of a breakdown. She would often express her frustration with the situation, but when it came time to act, she was paralyzed by fear that her actions would end her financial survival and, potentially, her access to her daughters. As the years wore on, she became more reclusive, less visible in the media, and more dependent on Andrew's influence. At one point, when asked about her inability to break free of this cycle, Sarah described it as a kind of emotional manipulation. "You're trapped in a world where everything is held over you," she said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "Your debts, your fears, your obligations, and all of it is controlled by those who know you have no choice but to comply." Sarah had learned that there were only two ways to survive in her position: to comply with the palace's demands or to risk everything in a desperate attempt for freedom. Eventually, Sarah's financial troubles became so severe that she was forced to make drastic decisions. She accepted a reality television offer that was met with ridicule but was, in essence, her only option to gain some semblance of independence. The show was not a success by any stretch of the imagination, but it allowed her to stay afloat, barely. It became another reminder of her tenuous hold on her life. As Sarah's debts continued to pile up, her reputation suffered. She was publicly criticized for her financial decisions. She was labeled a fallen duchess by the media, a tragic figure who couldn't quite find her footing after leaving the royal fold. But what no one knew at the time was that Sarah was still playing a game far more dangerous than anyone had realized. It wasn't just about money. It was about control. And it was about ensuring that Sarah remained part of a system that was built on silence, shame, and secrecy. In the years following this period, Sarah would often refer to the deal she made with herself to stay quiet for the sake of her daughters, for the sake of her family. But that deal was always precarious. Each loan, each favor, each helpful gesture from those involved with Andrew and Epstein only reinforced her silence. And with each passing year, Sarah would become more deeply entrenched in a system that sought to maintain its secrets, no matter the cost. In the next chapter, we will delve into the subtle ways Sarah began to receive warnings not from Andrew directly, but from individuals loyal to the crown, telling her to stop asking questions, stop investigating, and stop looking too closely at the connections she was beginning to uncover. We will look at how her questions about Epstein's activities were met with evasions and subtle threats that came not in the form of outright aggression, but through the quiet power of the royal network. The financial trap had been set, but it was the web of manipulation that would ultimately define Sarah's choices. For years, the truth about what Sarah Ferguson knew about Prince Andrew's ties to Jeffrey Epstein remained locked away in private conversations, fleeting moments of uncomfortable revelations, and whispered exchanges that were never meant to be heard. The walls of secrecy surrounding the British royal family have always been thick, but behind those walls, Sarah's growing awareness of the true nature of Andrew's relationship with Epstein was hard to ignore. Sarah Ferguson has always been known for her openness, her ability to speak candidly and without hesitation. Yet, when it came to the subjects that mattered most, the inner workings of the royal family, Andrew's relationship with Epstein, and the private meetings she knew were occurring, Sarah's silence was absolute. But now, years later, she is starting to break that silence, revealing what she learned and what she was told during moments when Andrew let his guard down. One of the first times Sarah became truly aware that something was off about Andrew's relationship with Epstein was in the early 2000s. Just after the scandalous photographs of her were released, showing her in compromising positions with an American businessman. In the aftermath of the scandal, Sarah says that she and Andrew had a tense, private conversation at Balmoral Castle. The palace had become a place of refuge for Sarah, who had no other secure place to go. During that conversation, Andrew allegedly began speaking vaguely about business with Epstein and other powerful individuals. Sarah had not yet realized the full extent of Epstein's crimes, but she had a nagging suspicion that there was something far darker going on beneath the surface. I remember asking him outright, "Is this something I need to worry about?" Sarah said in one of her recent interviews. He looked at me, and for a moment, I thought he would say something reassuring. But he didn't. He simply said, "This is not something you want to understand." It was a cryptic reply, one that left Sarah with more questions than answers. But back then, she didn't press him further. She trusted him, as she always had. He was still her ex-husband, and they had a shared history, one built on mutual respect, or so she thought. Over the years, Sarah would become increasingly unsettled by the things she heard and saw, even though she tried to remain outwardly supportive of Andrew. Whenever the subject of Epstein came up, Andrew would quickly change the topic, dismissing the man as a business acquaintance or an unfortunate distraction. But Sarah was not blind. She saw the way Epstein's name was spoken with reverence among some of Andrew's social circle. The discreet gatherings, the whispered references to deals and investments, and the cryptic phrases that never seemed to add up. Sarah recalls one particular moment during a visit to New York, when she and Andrew attended an event hosted by a prominent financier with known ties to Epstein. It was a lavish affair, filled with well-known personalities and powerful individuals. After the event, Sarah says she overheard a conversation between Andrew and the financier, where the financier was pressing Andrew for further favors. She remembers Andrew's response, "We'll take care of it, but it's going to cost more than last time." Sarah was left in the dark, but the tone of the conversation was enough to unsettle her. She later confronted Andrew about the exchange, asking what it meant. "It's just business," Andrew reportedly said, brushing her off. This conversation, while brief, marked a turning point for Sarah. She began to piece together the fragments of information she had gathered over the years. Epstein was no ordinary financier. He was a man who operated in the shadows, making deals that were not just about wealth, but about influence, power, and connections. And Andrew, whether through naivety or complicity, had become entangled in Epstein's world. The more Sarah asked questions, the more she noticed a shift in Andrew's behavior. He became more distant, more secretive. She recalls one evening when they were alone in a room at Sandringham. Sarah had finally gathered the courage to ask Andrew directly about his involvement with Epstein, about the whispers she had heard regarding his trips to the island. Andrew's reaction was not one of anger or denial, as she had expected. Instead, he looked at her with an expression that could only be described as resigned. "I don't want to drag you into this," he reportedly said. "You wouldn't understand. It's bigger than both of us." His words were chilling. Sarah did not press him further. What could she say? Her ex-husband had just admitted, in his own way, that he was involved in something far beyond her comprehension, something that was happening outside the confines of the royal family's carefully curated image. But it was not just that. It was the realization that, in his eyes, she was not meant to understand. Her role was to stay in the dark, to remain quiet, and to keep the royal family's secrets buried. But even as she kept silent, Sarah's discomfort grew. She began to hear rumors, small, offhand comments from former royal staff, whispers from people in Andrew's inner circle, and disturbing reports from her own sources. All of them seemed to point in the same direction, that Andrew was more than just a friend to Epstein. He was a participant in Epstein's world, and that world was full of manipulation, coercion, and dangerous dealings. One of the most unsettling moments for Sarah came when she overheard a conversation between Andrew and a business associate, one who had ties to Epstein. The conversation took place in a private study at one of the royal residences, and Sarah was only a few rooms away, but the words she overheard were enough to chill her to the bone. She heard Andrew mention something about favors that had been promised, and that certain people owed their loyalty because of past dealings. When Sarah later confronted him, Andrew dismissed the conversation as nothing of importance, but she could not shake the feeling that there was something far more sinister being hidden from her. "I couldn't stop thinking about it," Sarah said, recounting the moment in a recent interview. The things he said, the people he was talking about, it all seemed so wrong. But I was trapped. I couldn't go to anyone with this. I couldn't make a scene. I had nowhere else to turn. In her own words, Sarah describes a growing sense of isolation during these years. Despite being physically close to Andrew, despite the ongoing care for their daughters, she felt emotionally abandoned. She knew, or at least suspected, that there were things going on behind the scenes that no one wanted her to see. And yet, she was complicit in a silence that allowed those things to continue. This silence, however, was not of her own making. It was a silence created by fear. fear of losing her daughters, fear of losing her place in the royal family's world, fear of becoming another casualty of the Epstein scandal, just as so many other names had been tarnished in the wake of his downfall. For Sarah, remaining silent was not just a choice, it was a survival mechanism. Over time, Sarah began to feel the weight of the secrets she was keeping. She was being asked, in subtle but unmistakable ways, to ignore things that were happening in plain sight. People who were once friends became distant. Advisors who had once been loyal now spoke to her with a coldness that was hard to ignore. And all the while, Andrew seemed to grow more comfortable in his relationship with Epstein, more confident that his ties to the financier would remain hidden behind the iron curtain of royal secrecy. But Sarah's knowledge was no longer something she could push aside. The things she had overheard, the conversations she had witnessed, the hushed warnings she had received, all of it began to weigh heavily on her conscience. She could no longer pretend that she didn't know. And the more she considered the role she had played in maintaining the silence, the more she began to question her own complicity in the system that had allowed Epstein to operate unchecked for so long. In the end, it was the realization that she could not live with herself if she continued to stay quiet that led to her decision to speak out. Sarah's decision to reveal what she knew was not an easy one. It came after years of internal conflict, of living in the shadows of a family that demanded silence and loyalty above all else. But now, as the public begins to learn the truth about Andrew's ties to Epstein, Sarah is finally telling her story, the story of what she knew, what she witnessed, and how she was silenced for so long. In the next chapter, we will explore how Sarah's own fears were compounded by the royal network's tactics to keep her from speaking out. We will look at the subtle threats, the coded messages, and the quiet coercion that kept her in line, even as she grew more and more disillusioned with the family she had once been so loyal to. The walls of silence are coming down, and the truth is finally being heard. Sarah Ferguson has always spoken openly about her love for her daughters, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, and how her role as a mother was the cornerstone of her life. But behind the closed doors of royal palaces, as her world began to unravel, it wasn't just her own well-being she had to consider. It was the well-being of her children, and that was precisely where the true power of coercion lay. As Sarah would come to realize, her silence wasn't just a matter of loyalty to her ex-husband, Prince Andrew, or to the royal family, it was a matter of survival. As she looks back on the years of her forced silence, Sarah recounts numerous moments when the royal family's shadowed influence became unmistakably clear. The threat of losing her place within the fold, the constant pressure to comply with royal expectations, and the unseen hand of power that pushed her into submission all became evident during the darkest times of her life. It was a quiet kind of coercion now. No open threats or loud declarations of consequence, but a subtle, insidious manipulation that wore down her resistance over time. Sarah remembers one conversation in particular that remains etched in her memory. It took place in the summer of 2000, shortly after a scandalous tabloid story broke, revealing more details of her troubled finances and personal life. She had been struggling to maintain control of her image and finances while trying to stay relevant in the public eye. Yet, despite her best efforts, the pressure from the media and the public had reached a breaking point. It was then that Andrew approached her, as he often did, with promises of support, but it came with a catch. I remember it so clearly, Sarah recalls. We were sitting in the drawing room at Windsor. It was just the two of us, and I was exhausted. The weight of everything was crushing me. Then he looked at me, and I could see that there was something different in his eyes, something cold. Andrew reportedly told her that it was time to stop playing games with the press, to put an end to the drama and just go along with things. He suggested she focus on what really mattered, the children, the family, and the future. But what Sarah didn't expect was the sharp edge to his words. Remember, Sarah, he said, you wouldn't want to jeopardize the girl's future. You know how much influence I have and how much power the family holds. Everything could change in an instant if you don't toe the line. To Sarah, those words were more than just a casual remark. They were a stark reminder of her place in the royal world. The crown was not only a symbol of power, it was a weapon that could be wielded to control even the most well-meaning individuals. In that moment, Sarah realized that her silence wasn't just a matter of personal discretion, it was an imposition that came with the full weight of royal authority. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. As Sarah recalls this conversation, she now sees it as the moment when the true nature of her situation began to crystallize. She had always known that her life and the lives of her daughters were tied to the whims of the royal family. But this was different. This was an unspoken warning that the monarchy would not tolerate any form of dissent. If Sarah spoke out, if she revealed the truth about what she had witnessed or suspected, it would not just cost her her place in the family, it could cost her everything. Her daughters' titles, their future, their security. This was not the first time Sarah had been reminded of the consequences of defying the family. For years, the royal family had maintained an unspoken pact with Sarah, one that she had been expected to honor without question. In exchange for keeping the family's secrets, for maintaining the image of the dutiful, loyal ex-wife, Sarah would receive financial support and public respect. She would remain a part of the royal family's orbit, even if only on the periphery. But now, as the years passed and the scandal surrounding Andrew's ties to Epstein grew more pronounced, the pressure on Sarah became suffocating. The whispers in the halls of Buckingham Palace became louder, the subtle coercion more overt. The threat of her silence being broken became more real. For Sarah, the most insidious part of this coercion was not the financial dependence, it was the emotional manipulation. She recalls how, at one point, the royal family made it clear that her loyalty would be tested. During one particularly tense dinner at Sandringham, Sarah was confronted by several high-ranking members of the royal household. The conversation quickly turned to the subject of Andrew's friendship with Epstein and Sarah's role in keeping the family's reputation intact. She was told, in no uncertain terms, that her continued access to the royal family depended on her willingness to move past the rumors and remain supportive of Andrew. "You know how it works, Sarah," one royal aide allegedly said. "The family comes first. And when you chose to marry Andrew, you chose to marry the family. You're not just his ex-wife, you're part of the institution now. And that means putting aside your personal concerns for the greater good." Sarah says she was made to feel that her own feelings were irrelevant, that her instincts, her doubts, and her concerns about Andrew's behavior were not only unwanted, they were dangerous. If she didn't comply, she would face the consequences. She would be exiled from the family. Her daughters would lose their royal connections. Their titles could be revoked, and that was something no mother could ever risk. But the emotional coercion didn't stop there. Sarah was also made to feel responsible for protecting the royal family's public image. The pressure to maintain the image of unity of a royal family that was above reproach was overwhelming. The palace had a carefully crafted narrative. Andrew was the misguided royal who had made poor choices, but he was still a member of the family, and he was still a prince. Sarah's job, in essence, was to play the part of the dutiful ex-wife who would stand by him in public, even when she knew the truth. In exchange, she would be allowed to keep her place in the royal fold, and her daughters would continue to enjoy their royal titles and privileges. In her moments of clarity, Sarah would ask herself if it was all worth it. Was the cost of silence truly worth the price of preserving the facade of royal unity? Was she betraying not only herself, but the very people she had sworn to protect? The survivors, the victims, and most importantly, her own daughters? But the coercion was so deeply ingrained, so pervasive, that Sarah could not bring herself to speak out. She felt trapped in a gilded cage, a woman who had once been the embodiment of freedom and individuality now bound by the chains of loyalty, fear, and duty. As the years went on and Andrew's scandal worsened, Sarah found herself at a crossroads. In one of her more candid moments, she admitted to a close confidant that she felt like she was living in two worlds. The world of the royal family, where appearances were everything, and the world of truth, where the lies could no longer be ignored. But she feared that if she stepped away from the royal narrative, if she exposed the truth, she would lose everything. "I couldn't risk it," she said, reflecting on the years of silence. "Everything I had built, everything I thought I could protect, it all hinged on keeping the family's secrets. And that meant keeping quiet about the things I knew, the things I had seen, and the things I had heard." But as the scandal surrounding Andrew's ties to Epstein escalated, the walls began to close in. Sarah knew that the day would come when the truth would have to be revealed, when she could no longer remain silent. It was not just about protecting Andrew or the monarchy anymore. It was about protecting herself and her family. It was about breaking free from the psychological and emotional manipulation that had held her captive for so long. And so, Sarah began to speak. Slowly at first, in private conversations with trusted friends. Then, in interviews, where she carefully began to peel back the layers of silence and reveal the truth about what had been done to her. She spoke not just about Andrew, but but about the system that had coerced her into remaining silent for so long, the system that used the crown as a tool of manipulation and control. In the end, Sarah's decision to break her silence was a choice between survival and subjugation. It was a decision to reclaim her voice, to regain control over her own narrative. But it came at a great cost. The crown, which had once provided her with comfort and protection, had now become the very thing that threatened to destroy her. As Sarah continues to speak out, the royal family's carefully constructed walls of secrecy begin to crumble. The truth, which was once locked away behind those walls, is now spilling out, piece by piece. And with each new revelation, the power of the monarchy and the power of silence becomes clearer. In the next chapter, we will look at the aftermath of Sarah's decision to speak out, the public reaction, the royal family's response, and the personal consequences of breaking free from the chains of coercion. We will also examine the broader implications of Sarah's story and what it reveals about the lengths to which powerful institutions will go to maintain control. The silence is over. And now, the reckoning begins. As the story of Sarah Ferguson's silence and eventual rebellion continues to unfold, one of the most intriguing aspects of her revelations is the claim of a secret journal. A journal, she says, where she documented the years of her emotional turmoil, her growing suspicions, and the quiet compromises she made to survive within the royal family. This journal, according to Sarah, contained not just personal reflections, but also accounts of conversations she had overheard, moments of disquiet that she dared not share with anyone else. The question that remains, does this journal really exist, or is it merely the product of an imaginative mind looking to reconcile with a past that cannot be undone? To date, no physical evidence of the journal has emerged. There are no photographs of its pages, no direct leaks from the contents, and no solid proof that such a document exists beyond Sarah's own testimony. However, Sarah has mentioned the journal in various interviews, hinting at its existence and alluding to the fact that it contains details that would forever change the public perception of the royal family and Andrew's connection to the Epstein scandal. In one particular interview, Sarah was asked directly about the journal. She responded with a mixture of hesitation and defiance. "I kept it for myself," she said, "because I needed to hold on to something. It wasn't about the truth of the moment, it was about understanding what was happening to me." When pressed further, she declined to confirm or deny whether the journal had been written in coded language.